Hello and welcome. I'm so happy to have you here with me on this video on grief and loss. Dying is something we human beings do continuously, not just at the end of our physical lives. This is a quotation by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Whenever we experience any type of loss, we go through 5 stages of grief, or also known as patterns of adjustment, as originally designed in the grief cycle model by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, the hospice pioneer and author of the book on death and dying. Her model is also known as the 5 stages of loss. The agonizing and distressing effects of grief and loss, whether sudden or foreseen, negatively impacts on our reality and completely diminishes our ability to engage in our lives. To be completely congruent, grief and loss is a very personal topic, something that's dear to my own heart. Grief and death and dying is something that I am intimately understand, for the simple reason that when I was 23 years old, my only brother was killed in a car accident. And a few years later, my mum ended up succumbing to cancer. Years later, those experiences led me to training as a hospice caregiver, and something I really did enjoy performing and working in the field as a caregiver. Understanding the stages of loss model has also significantly impacted the way I work with my trauma counseling clients, and it's also formed a really vital foundation on my therapy work, helping so many of my clients to gain a far better understanding of what they have unwittingly experienced as a result of their losses. So originally, this model, the 5 stages of loss, was intended to describe the process a patient would go through when informed about an illness, especially a terminal illness, hence Kubler-Ross's work in hospice. But although this model was largely applicable to death and dying and terminal illness, it can also be applied to psychological traumas, such as a relationship breakup, crime, hijacking or carjacking as the Americans call it, perhaps abuse, maybe retrenchments, an accident, or even in the more mundane losses that we have, like we lose our purse, our wallet, our car keys, as well as our cell phones. We actually end up going through the same stages of loss, believe it or not. And so I was thinking as to how important these stages of loss are and pertinent they are, particularly now during the COVID-19 pandemic, where the stringent lockdown and all social distancing regulations have been enforced upon millions of us, if not billions, around the globe. So that's why I thought I'd prepare a video for you. As creatures of habit, human beings intently dislike change. In fact, we relish whatever is familiar as our normal, because that's what gives us comfort and makes us feel safe and secure, our routines, our habits. Even if it's a temporary or a false sense of security, anything unfamiliar is what we end up resisting. So naturally, of course, we're going to resist this change in our lifestyles. So undoubtedly, the quality of our lives has changed radically as a result of the pandemic. Literally overnight, this pandemic created what is known as a novel situation, completely new, totally unexpected, reshaping our lives in the most unprecedented ways. Suddenly, we were trapped in lockdown like virtual prisoners living in our own homes. And as a result, we've suffered significant losses, and in a variety of ways, which I'm going to explain in a moment. Some of which we obviously anticipated, and therefore one could say were predictable. But for many of us, it has been completely unexpected losses. And it's small wonder that so many people are grappling with their lives at the moment. Their mental health has been affected, and naturally they are grieving for their individual losses. Some are big and some are small, granted, but they still are very appropriate to each individual's experience of loss in some shape or form. So I'm going to briefly touch on a few of the obvious and maybe the not so obvious losses which may have affected you during this time. And as I go through them, you might think, oh, this is not appropriate to me, but just go along with what I'm explaining, because I think you might realize that actually this has affected you more than you've given yourself credibility and also credence. So please note, I'm neither pro nor against anybody's belief systems or their lifestyle choices. I'm simply going to be covering content here that I believe is kind of objective in a broad-based manner as best as possible. It's really to uncover the various losses that what I believe is my Stress Gone method community, as well as the clients of mine who have gone through these suffered these losses and have been grieving. So some of the losses that I'm going to explain might seem trite or trivial to you, yet to somebody else this is particularly important. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to touch on a couple of these categories, and then I'll explain the stages of loss that we all experience and what that actually means to us, those 5 stages of loss that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross originally created. And lastly, I'm going to cover in the final section, I'm going to suggest some coping mechanisms that you could use to help you to cope with your loss. So the first thing is the category of what I've classified as pandemic category of losses. First and foremost, there's the obvious, and naturally the greatest tragedy of all, that being the loss of a loved one, a colleague, or a friend, or someone that you know of who has contracted the COVID-19 virus and passed away. Naturally, I'm also going to include those who succumb to comorbidities at the time, during this time of lockdown, as well as those who have tragically elected to take their own lives. I believe that the depression and suicide rates have exponentially accelerated, literally at alarming rates during the past few months. I saw some statistics over the last few days that in America, the suicide hotline has, in the last month or two, their call rate has increased by 600%. In terms of what people are medicating, it's gone up. Depression pills have gone up, the use of them have gone up by like 34%, which is extremely high, and for me is deeply, deeply tragic in terms of where we are. So if you've lost a loved one during these times, please accept my sincere condolences and sympathies to you and your family at this tragic time of loss. I can't imagine how difficult it has been for you, and especially having personal experience of losing a loved one at the best of times is really awful to experience. But at a time like this pandemic time period where circumstances and regulations have been enforced at the hospitals that have been so harsh because of the pandemic that you may not have been able to go and spend or visit your loved ones while they were hospitalized and be with them in those final days or the final hours before they passed on. And I can just imagine how that has added to your extreme grief in not having had that opportunity. And then there are many who I've read of in social media who have been unable to conduct their traditional funerals, memorial services, or wakes, whatever is applicable to you in your culture, in order to be able to respect and honor your loved ones as a goodbye. Now, this natural and normal mourning process is very important for us because it actually helps one to achieve a sense of closure over losing someone. And now, no longer being able to gather in large groups or have these occasions to commemorate and remember your loved ones who've passed on, then not having the support and the loving gathering of those who always come to be with us when we are in mourning, who come and pay their respects, This must have also been really difficult for you not to be able to go through that natural and normal process that we are so used to. So I cannot begin to comprehend how difficult that must have been for you to be alone and in total isolation, having lost a loved one. So I really hope that what I'm going to share with you a little bit later in this video is going to be of particular benefit to you. Unfortunately, almost a third, I believe, to 2/3 of the world's population has been in lockdown. And this has changed our lives not only significantly, but almost unrecognizably, in that we've lost our former freedoms and the gregarious kind of lifestyles that we naturally were used to. In fact, we once took this for complete granted. And suddenly being cooped up in our homes during lockdown, literally locked inside for days, weeks, and in some countries for months. We are almost on our 4th month here in South Africa. This has been harrowing for the vast majority of people. Not being able to walk freely, not being able to go to the parks, exercise, go to nature trails, maybe go to the gym or visit the beach and soak up the sun. All of these are worthy of us feeling a huge sense of grief and loss. This is a loss of our normality, if I can put it that way. It's also a loss of our freedoms, as well as a lifestyle loss. Something that was completely forced upon us. It was not something that we chose. So your specific loss might be completely unique to you, and in terms of how you've experienced it. But as I say, I'm just generalizing in terms of this message, because there are so many significant losses here. Another one is what I call a social loss, whereby you cannot just pop down to your local coffee shop or the restaurant or maybe the bar or a pub where you used to spend a lot of your time and quality time with your mates. Not being able to socialize and participate in any kind of group activities, hobbies or sports events, etc. Most people really do enjoy a gregarious and an alive, active social life. And suddenly that's just been taken away. One could argue that maybe their very active social life was some form of escape mechanism. But nonetheless, socializing is innate part of our human psyche, and as we are gregarious by nature, we often define ourselves by our friends and the company that we keep. And without this has created a huge loss. And many people have ended up going into anxiety and depression and trauma as a result of that. And one can understand why the suicide rates are so high. Sure, there are those people who are very creative, and I've loved seeing this on social media, where they are having group hangouts and maybe online book clubs, drinking, and even sharing meals together online, just as a means of trying to still get together. And it's possibly better than doing nothing at all, but certainly it doesn't replace that bonding that we have when we are together in each other's company. Being able to give each other a hug, being able to just be together and sort of, play together, have fun together. That kind of bonding gives and releases what is known as oxytocin. And oxytocin is known as our bonding and bliss hormone. It's also known as the happy hormone. So without us having these opportunities to have these hugs and huddle up together and giggle and laugh together, has literally taken that opportunity away from us. So something that we used to look forward to, which was that oxytocin sort of being released, you might not have known that, but that was what would come from those social gatherings. And now you're in isolation, so you're no longer getting your upliftment. You might still be laughing and joking, but it's not quite the same, and I'm sure you totally understand what I'm saying. So as a result, this loss has caused a lot of, as I say, anxiety, depression, suicidal ideations, and stress on people. Again, that sense of normality and what was familiar in those habitual social activities that you had, like maybe every Monday you would meet someone at the pub, and every Thursday somebody else. All of that has been completely shattered and taken away from you. So that's a huge loss. Another very important loss that I am seeing is where, and this has caused a lot of anxiety, depression, and grief for some people, is the travel ban. So not being able to travel to spend time and quality time, or even just a quick visit to your friends or your loved ones, especially the elderly. So by that being perhaps your elderly parents or your grandparents, and if you have children and grandchildren, not being able to see them either. Now in South Africa, we've had seriously ridiculous regulations imposed upon divorced and single parents who share joint custody of their children. Our government have made it almost impossible for them to spend time with their children. So whoever has the child, the other one can't see the child. And I just cannot begin to imagine how difficult that is for both the parents as well as the children. And little children, how do you explain this to them where they don't have this understanding? So there's another loss there. Then in terms of relationships, many have been tested to the nth degree, either by being enforced into a state of separation because of the very travel bans I just mentioned, or as a result of being forced to stay together now. And this has been particularly difficult for those who are already in highly abusive situations. So that is a loss of their safety and security. And I can't imagine how difficult that is, to actually be living with somebody who is imposing that kind of abuse on you, mentally, emotionally, physically. Maybe it's a narcissist, maybe it's actually somebody who you live with who's physically violent. So that is extremely difficult. And I can also believe that the pandemic and lockdown has put pressure on relationships that were kind of teetering on the edge prior to this. And then this is the final straw that has completely soured the relationship. And sadly, perhaps you're one of the people who is going to be affected that way by a breakup or a divorce that is inevitable. And I'm also led to believe, from what I've seen in terms of statistics, I believe there's going to be a massive increase in births as well as divorce rates expected to escalate as a result of this pandemic. Then the next category is those who have unfortunately lost their jobs, their incomes, their businesses, their homes, perhaps their retirement investments, or for some, the stock losses on the stock market have crashed, all of which are significant losses to each of those individuals. These losses also come with a loss of identity and a loss of your status in your community, because we do define ourselves, rightly or wrongly, we define ourselves by our work, our income, our homes, our possessions. So there are a number of different losses that are related to that specific aspect. The next one is, depending on your country, your province, or your state that you live in, you may have had varying regulations enforced upon you, and many have suffered losses in terms of these sudden adjustments, particularly to your lifestyle choices. And here I'm referring specifically to cigarette and alcohol bans. Here in South Africa, that was imposed right from the get-go, and that has caused significant trauma and drama for a lot of people, especially those who are reliant upon these substances and habits just to get them through the day. That must be really, really difficult to have your regular coping mechanisms completely pulled from underneath you. Aside from the obvious and unpleasant, painful withdrawal symptoms, losing your habitual coping mechanism has definitely resulted in a far greater sense of anxiety and depression and stress and completely unnecessary trauma, exacerbating those people's mental health issues and their feelings of safety and security. Because remember, a lot of people The reason they have coping mechanisms is those coping mechanisms are there specifically to help them to cope with life. Those coping mechanisms, whether they're good or bad, rightly or wrongly, that's not the case. Those coping mechanisms give them a sense of safety and security, and in a way protects them. And that's now been taken away from them. So I can understand the devastating loss that has been on them. Then not being able to get to your local hairdresser, barber, your salon, the spa, the nail bar. This has been a crisis for a lot of people. I've seen many posts on social media where people were freaking out just because they couldn't go and have their hair done or their nails done. So these kind of restrictions have also been imposed on us in terms of our retail shopping, and very ordinary, very regular and normal things that we all once enjoyed taken away from us. So that's another loss. And I think you're starting to see how I'm stacking these losses one on top of the other. So maybe one looks at this and goes, well, yeah, you know, perhaps you haven't lost a loved one, so you don't perceive your loss to be as big and as significant. But each of these small losses and each thing that's been taken away systematically has accounted to the losses that you're feeling. And when I get into the stages of loss, I think this will become much more appropriate to you in terms of what I mean. The last one I want to touch on, and I toyed with whether I should put this in here or not, but I'm going to, because I think it's really, really important, if it's not already obvious, is the almost ethereal, but really, really important authoritarian, draconian, even dystopian, suffocating restrictions and regulations that were suddenly imposed upon us, which should be ringing really loud alarm bells for everybody at this point in time. The consequences and the amount of our basic human rights, our liberties and our freedoms, including our freedom of speech and our freedom to access information, has been taken away from us in so many respects. This is more especially prevalent now that social media, the media as well, and several search engines are now policing and placing restrictions, and in some cases literally placing outright bans on content and information that is being shared. Personally, I know of several large platforms where their channels were unceremoniously closed overnight without any warning. They completely lost decades worth of and years worth of content, as well as their hundreds of thousands, if not millions of followers in the process. That's a significant impact on those businesses and the income that they generate from those online channels. Now, these kinds of bans dangerously threaten our democracy, our freedom of speech, our access to whatever information we choose to explore online as adults. And this certainly smacks of and feels like such a draconian, authoritarian Big Daddy or Uncle Sam has sucked the life force out of what we can have access to. And that's why I say it is subtly attacking our basic human rights, which is completely unnecessary. It's draconian, and in my opinion, totally underhanded, and something I don't believe that we warrant having taken away from us. And when you let that sink in, that is a significant loss to how it changes our lives. There are other aspects that I'm sure I haven't touched on, so please forgive me if I've omitted a loss that you are feeling that I didn't touch on. I'm sure you get the picture, and in a moment I'm sure you'll understand the crux of the stages of loss that I'll be covering next, so hopefully you'll benefit from those. So the next section I'm going to now cover is those very stages of loss that I mentioned. We all go through typically what is known as 5 stages of loss, and you'll probably be aware and recognize how these steps will be applicable to your individual and unique circumstances. This model was designed to help people to understand what is happening internally, so that when they are dealing with their individual losses, it's actually easier to understand what they are going through, and also to normalize what they are going through. So the 5 stages of grief typically are: denial is the first one. Secondly is then anger. Thirdly, bargaining. Fourth is depression. And the fifth is a state of acceptance. Now, as I go through each of these, I think it'll become clear as to the impact that it's had on you. And especially when I do hospice work and work with people in terms of trauma, and we access the losses that they've gone through. Once I explain this to them, they have such an aha moment in terms of understanding, what I'm going through was natural and normal. I'm not losing my mind, because I'm angry or because I'm depressed. Or vacillating like this from one aspect to the other. This is natural and normal. And I find that just understanding this really helps people feel so much better as a result. And that's why I chose to actually bring this video up as part of the series. So firstly, I want you to understand that these stages of loss, just because I'm explaining them in a linear fashion, they are not linear, all right? Nor are they equal in experience. So the other thing is, people tend to go through these stages, but not always in the sequence that I'm going to explain. And sometimes some stages can be revisited time and again over a period of time. So by that I mean, I lost my mum and my brother my brother well over 2 decades ago, and my mum just over 2 decades ago. So every now and again, I will still go back to feeling angry and depressed about losing them. And then there are other times where I find myself even bargaining 2 decades later. What if only, could have, should have, all of those kind of things. So this is why I say we can revisit these stages at any given time. And it's not a linear process, and it's not like once you visited there, it's gone forever. No, you can cycle back through that again for shorter periods, or maybe less intense periods than when it's still fresh and raw in terms of your grief and your loss. So that's why I say I want you to see these stages, the transition between these stages, more like an ebb and flow, as opposed to a rigid linear progression or transition. So let's deal with denial first. This is the stage where we say things like, oh no, I feel fine. Or we'll say, this can't be happening. No, it's not happening to me kind of stage. This is because you're in a state of shock, disbelief and confusion, that you cannot believe that this has actually happened. And I'm sure if you remember when lockdown first happened, you kind of wake up in the morning thinking, no, I can go outside or I can go somewhere, and then, it would set in and it's like, oh no, I can't believe this is actually happening. So that's what that denial, it's almost like a twilight kind of space, and you will find it's also a temporary defense mechanism, which is perfectly natural for us to protect our inner feelings, the hurt that we feel. Denial is also, it can be conscious, but it can also be a subconscious refusal to accept the facts and the reality of the situation. And as a result, this tends to leave one feeling powerless, helpless, hopeless, maybe even frozen or numb. Now, numbness is an emotion and is a very powerful feeling, which I work with a lot when I work with clients who have gone through a loss and or trauma. And that numbness is really protecting us from those raw, painful, heartbreaking emotions that we're not ready to face. So these feelings are often replaced also with a heightened awareness of situations as well. Denial is quite a broad space, and as I say, it is unique to each individual, and so you might experience it slightly differently. So the next stage that we go on to is anger. This is the why me and who is to blame, this is not fair kind of stage, or I'm angry and I hate the world. For some people, they even in that moment they hate their God or whoever they believe in. It even gets to a point where you're angry at yourself, you're angry at others, especially those close to you. They tend to really get a hammering as a result of this. Your anger could also be because of you felt like you made a wrong decision, or you've lost control. Maybe you're angry at the doctor, as I say, life, at family, even God, maybe at the government, you know, especially now with COVID-19 and the whole pandemic, regulations, all that kind of thing. Maybe there's a huge amount of resentment towards the government and health authorities at this point in time. This can also present itself as rage, as resentment, as irritation and snappiness, even moodiness. At times it can also, the anger can present itself as envy and jealousy as well. That can often become prevalent because this happened to you and not to somebody else. So that is where that it's so unfair that it happened to me, and how dare it happen to me but not to you. That and there can be quite a lot of jealousy and envy, believe it or not, in that space, and I saw that a lot in my hospice work. We also can use the anger that we're feeling that is hurting inside, we can almost use that as revenge against somebody else, and that can bring up a lot of fear of getting hurt even more, and as a result we will then hold people away from us too, because we are so hurt inside, and so we lash out in anger. But what we're actually trying to do is we're trying to protect our heart from being hurt again. So you'll find that a lot of people who really get angry when they are grieving, that they tend to withdraw a lot. So that anger can also feel, because you feel everything is so chaotic inside that you feel totally out of control within yourself. It's just because that pain is so overbearing that it feels like you're out of control. And therefore, what often happens is that we then try and control those around us because we're feeling out of control. So it's almost like a mirror response, if that makes sense. I feel out of control, so if I can control you or my circumstances outside of me, then I feel that I'm in control of myself. I'm sure you understand what I mean there. So knowing or having an understanding of this can be really helpful, not only to you, but to if you see your friends or family or colleagues going through this, and especially a patient who is terminally ill. They might also lash out because they're realizing that they're losing their time here. So please be patient and kind and understanding when a grieving person lashes out in anger. But if you're the person who's grieving, sit with your anger. It's a very powerful emotion, and it doesn't have to be the end of the world. And I really want to bring up something else I addressed in another video I did the other day, in that if we do not resolve our hurt because of the pains of the past, so often what we end up doing is we take that hurt into another relationship. And there's that saying that hurt people hurt people. So in other words, a person who's hurt and has a lot of pain inside them and that repressed anger, they will take that out on somebody else. And this is so often where we see the relationships like a bully. A bully is really a person who's hurting so badly, but they lash out at somebody else. And they think by picking on a weaker victim, that makes them feel more powerful, because actually they don't have that sense of control within, which is just what I've covered now in terms of the anger. So I really hope that that makes sense. The third stage we go through is bargaining. This is that yes, but, or if only stage. The stage that involves the hope that an individual somehow could have postponed or delayed their death, and that includes bargaining with life or whatever God a person believes in. I see this a lot, specifically in terms of my hospice patients. Their family and loved ones will often say, you know, I'm going to pray that I promise that if I'm a good person or if I behave better, maybe my mum or my loved ones will end up staying longer. And we see them sort of almost begging, please let me live until this happens or until that happens. So there's various aspects of bargaining that takes place. Bargaining really is a means of trying to help us to accept what's happening and or to justify, as well as to become a part of the process. You may feel it's necessary to gain, for instance, if you have a loved one who's really ill, you may feel it's necessary to gain a second opinion, or to try a new diet, or want to dedicate your life to God or to religion in exchange for a reformed lifestyle. And in that way, you're delaying the inevitable of your loss taking place. Again, it is a means of coping and also trying to control the situation. People facing trauma in a relationship breakup might ask if they could have a friendship in this bargaining phase. So in other words, the relationship is breaking up, but could we just stay friends? Could we kind of check in with each other occasionally to see how each other are doing? That's the bargaining phase. In other words, they're looking for hope, okay, and meaning in this. And it can be a wonderfully creative stage, but sometimes it's really, really painful, because that hope is a means of trying to protect one in the future from the now, which is way too painful to cope with. So that's bargaining. The fourth stage is depression. Now, this is the I'm so sad, why bother with anything? Or if somebody's terminally ill, I'm going to die, what's the point kind of stage. This is what I saw my mum go through after my brother had passed, and I realized that she didn't want to be here anymore because she basically wanted to be with him. And I could see her in her final stages. She just had kind of just given up. There was no point. And that's where years later, doing the therapy work, I actually understood more about where she was. And that's why my hospice training was also very important for me to understand my own grieving process. So those emotions in terms of this depression stage will vary from person to person. It could involve sadness, regret, fear, guilt, numbness again. It could be fatigue, perhaps feeling alone, maybe feeling trapped, exposed, or that naked feeling where you just feel so raw inside. So if facing death, this shows the person has at least begun to accept their facing the reality that death is certain and inevitable. So this is normal and should not be feared if you're sitting with somebody in that space. And it's also where a lot of very powerful emotional work gets done. For instance, the person may become very silent and refuse visitors. They want to spend more time alone and grieving. This process allows the dying person to disconnect themselves from their things as well as the people that they love and have affection for. Now, as a result of this, you might find that because you're the one who has lost someone, that you might find that you are pushing people away, you are disconnecting from people, you don't want to be involved. If this is the case, I really recommend that you use this remaining time of lockdown to actually get in touch with your grieving, to get in touch with what you are feeling inside. And if it means lying in bed or on the couch for a couple of days, or even that feeling of just staring at the wall and doing nothing, it's just like, then do that if that's going to help you. Because depression is a very powerful stage of our lives when we go through this grief cycle. It's a way of us processing very deeply seated emotions that sometimes we can't even quantify, but we can feel because our hearts feel so heavy, we feel so heavy. So if it means having to go through that process, then by all means do that. But I want to bring up a huge caution. As humans, we are highly adaptable creatures, and so we might resist something, but for a while we will kind of go, oh, okay, all right, this has happened, and we then accept it. So I want to be very cautious that if you are struggling with depression and you found yourself going deeper and deeper and deeper into depression, now obviously being at home, nobody's checking in on you, you don't have to show up, you don't have to put makeup on, you don't have to put on that nice smiley face when you see people, but actually inside it's like a living hell, right? So as a result, you might have become really accustomed to sloughing around the house, lying on the couch, vegging, watching TV all day or binge watching series. I just want you to be very aware and very careful that your depression is now not becoming an accustomed habit and your new normal in terms of how you live your life, just because you've been forced to live in a lockdown state. Please be very, very aware that if this is where you're at in terms of your own depression, please be aware of the effect that this is having on you. And then actually start doing things to mitigate that. When you can, get up and go out. When you can, go for a walk. Maybe start doing some exercise. Not to negate your depression entirely, but also just to change the pace a little bit, because you do not want to get trapped in a state of depression. It is very easy to get stuck in a state of depression, as well as very easy to get stuck in a state of anger. Those two are the two I see a lot as a therapist. That's where people are trapped. So I just wanted to bring that word of caution to you, just to have the awareness. So the fifth stage is known as acceptance. This is the stage where we go, you know what? I know I'm going to be okay. I am ready. I don't want to struggle anymore. I can't fight it. The very least I can do is kind of prepare and accept. And in that way, the person who's passing on, there's a level of detachment and objectivity that begins to surface, and you can actually see them going through this phase. And this is where you can start to see the gift. Now, this final acceptance also helps us to come to a place of peace and understanding within ourselves, that either death is approaching, or if we've lost a loved one in death, that it's done and there is no turning back. Generally, the person in this stage may want to be left alone as well, as they are going through the process of finalizing and coming to terms with their acceptance. Also, feelings and physical pain may be non-existent if a person is passing on as they're starting to enter into this final stage, especially if they've been terminally ill for a long time. This stage has also been described as the end of dying struggle in terms of losing someone. Okay, I remember my mum going through this very, very clearly, and that was the benefit of, if I can put it that way, of losing her over a period of time versus losing my brother in an instant. Losing my brother in an instant, yes, we had to come to terms with it. There was no uncertain terms that he'd passed, and that was it. So there was a benefit of it's done and dusted, and I can't turn it back. Whereas with my mum, it was a case of we had time together with her. We could prepare what she wanted for her funeral, what she wanted sung, the hymns, and what she wanted a dress in. Now, I know that sounds kind of macabre, but it was actually important for her. Those were her final stages, and that was where she was starting to accept where she was at. And it also helped us. It really made life so much easier knowing exactly what she wanted, how she wanted things, what we were to give away, what was to be gifted to whomever she wanted. We made lists of everything. It really was very, very beneficial. And so that helped us to transit through the whole grieving cycle a lot easier, because I knew that everything I was doing was fulfilling her wishes. It was so much easier. Whereas what we did for my brother, I have no idea whether it was fulfilling his wishes or not. What wishes does a 19-year-old have? He barely even had a will. So yeah, we didn't know. We just were kind of left floundering as to what are we going to do for him. So this final stage really does give, if you are transiting in this transitory space with somebody who's passing, it is a very powerful space to help them as well as to help yourself in terms of coming to acceptance. And then it's also a phase where we, the ones who are left behind, are able to kind of transit back into normal society and life and socializing and getting back to moving forward. So in this phase of acceptance, appropriate to lockdown, it could be coming to terms with the fact, okay, so I am having to stay in the house under lockdown, and this pandemic's not going away. Okay, so now what can I do with my time? How can I use my time wisely, productively, creatively? What do I do? So when you understand that and you get to that point, suddenly a whole lot of stress is taken off your shoulders because you've let go. You're no longer resisting and fighting the thing that you have lost, which was your freedom in terms of living, a free lifestyle, a gregarious lifestyle. So I hope that's given you a context in terms of the categories of the losses that we've gone through and experienced, either individually or collectively, and then how we generally experience our stages of losses with those 5 stages of losses. So I really hope that that has been beneficial. So the final part of my talk now is supportive techniques that I believe will help you to cope where you are. Firstly, I highly recommend you work your way through my Stress Gone method and program at your own pace, specifically my book, because in there I cover various aspects of grief and loss in terms of how stress relates to anger, depression, as well as addictions, and then I have one chapter that I dedicate to the stages of loss. So you can go and reread that and revisit that and spend time there. And I encourage you to try the various tips and techniques that I recommend in the book as a way of helping you. Secondly, you can use the audio track, the PS Tech audio track, which is a part of my book as well. You'll see the link there in my book. I've got it clearly highlighted. And download the audio. They literally are 11 minutes each. Listen to the instructions so that you know what to do. In the back of my book, you'll see I have a whole workbook section where I give you a worksheet and I give you details as to how to follow the audio, so you can use those two simultaneously. This will help you to clear, neutralize, maybe even erase any associated anger, depression, grief or loss, trauma, anxiety, panic attacks, any of those kind of emotions, and probably a whole myriad of others, even that numbness that I was talking about earlier, that have resulted in your losses. On a personal level, I've used PS Tech for many, many years, and I have had so much amazing feedback from many of my clients who have used it. It really is beneficial and can seriously turn your life around. So I really recommend using that as a wonderful life-changing tool, and I hope you'll benefit from that. Thirdly, you can watch another video that I'm going to put up on inner child work. Now, this is a very simple self-help process that can really assist you to soothe those feelings of anxiety, panic, safety, security, helplessness, hopelessness, despair. Inner child work is working with yourself, your younger self, and helping you through that. So that's a really lovely process as well, and I enjoy it. It's something I frequently use, even on myself as well, because it's just a lovely way of feeling really safe and secure. So that's another one. And the fourth and last one is, if you need some help, I am available to you, and you're most welcome to book an online session with me. I will take you through the process. My first session is a 2-hour session, and then we can do a follow-up. So you can book a 3-hour session, so it'll be a 2-hour initial session and then an hour's follow-up session. And you will find the link somewhere together with this video as to how you can book that session. So that's it from me. But in closing, I thought I might just share with you, I touched on the sort of draconian laws in terms of how social media is changing and all of those crazy policing and censorships and all that kind of thing. So if you're interested in something around that and you would like to know more, here are some sites that I would recommend that you follow. One is Brian Rose of London Real. He does some amazing work, as does Del Bigtree. Dr. Rashid Buttar is another one. Robert, also known as Bobby Kennedy, he was JFK's nephew. He's doing some really, really good work. Dr. Judy Milkovits is another one. Dr. Zach Bush is another. Dr. Kelly Brogan, and another one is Dr. Sherry Tenpenny. Those are just a few names who are highlighting these draconian bans on our social media and the censorships, as well as what's going on behind the scenes with respect to the COVID and the pandemic, COVID-19, vaccinations, 5G, etc., etc. So yes, if you're interested in those kind of topics, follow those people, and I think you will find them really beneficial. So there it is. I hope this has been beneficial to you, and I would love to hear what you think. If you want to drop me an email, if you need some help, I look forward to connecting with you, or connect with me on my social media. So take care, God bless you, and lots of love to you wherever you are. May your losses be minimized, and may these very simple techniques that I've shared with you today, may they really, really help you to understand yourself and to be able to heal yourself, so that you may find peace within you. Take care and all the best. Thank you. Bye.